There was something strange about the bodies lying in the snow. When American troops finally reached the small clearing, they expected to find the usual signs of another hard fight. Broken rifles, burned vehicles, frozen footprints. Instead, they found wounded
If you want more content like this, subscribe now and comment below.
soldiers who had never been given the chance to defend themselves. Bandages were still wrapped around bleeding arms. Medical pouches lay open beside them. Several helmets had rolled into the snow. The silence felt wrong. These men had survived the battle only to be shot afterward. The first reports arriving at headquarters were confusing. Some officers believed it had been crossfire. Others thought artillery shells had landed after the fighting had ended. But the closer investigators looked, the less those explanations made sense. The bullets had come from close range. The firing angles told a different story. Someone had made a deliberate decision. What nobody knew yet was who had given that order. And when General George S. Patton finally learned what had happened, the search for that answer became far more than another battlefield investigation. The story begins during one of the coldest periods of the Second World War. It was December 1944. Western Europe was covered by snow, ice, and freezing winds. The German army had launched its last great offensive through the Ardennes forest. History remembers it as the Battle of the Bulge. Thousands of American soldiers suddenly found themselves fighting in thick forests where visibility could disappear within a few hundred meters. Roads turned into frozen mud. Supply trucks became trapped. Radios often failed inside the dense woods. Every village became a prize worth fighting for. You can almost feel the freezing air cutting through heavy winter uniforms. Engines struggled to start each morning. Rifles had to be cleaned constantly to keep them working. Even experienced soldiers admitted that the weather itself felt like another enemy. At the same time, General George S. Patton was leading the U.S. Third Army. Famous for speed, discipline, and aggressive maneuver, Patton had already earned a reputation that terrified many German commanders. His armored divisions rarely waited for perfect conditions. If a road existed, Patton wanted tanks moving across it. If a bridge still stood, he wanted it crossed before the enemy could react. While Patton pushed north to relieve the surrounded defenders at Bastogne, countless smaller engagements were unfolding across Belgium and Luxembourg. Many of these actions never appeared in newspaper headlines. Yet they placed exhausted American infantrymen face to face with equally desperate German soldiers who knew Germany was running out of time. One such clash took place near a small wooded area outside a farming village. The exact ground seemed ordinary. Thin pine trees, snow-covered fields, narrow roads bordered by frozen ditches. Nothing suggested that this quiet corner would soon become the center of a story remembered for generations. The fighting began before sunrise. American infantry advanced carefully along the forest edge while engineers searched for hidden mines. German machine guns suddenly opened fire from concealed positions among the trees. Within seconds, the peaceful silence disappeared beneath rifle fire, mortar explosions, and shouted commands. The Americans responded with disciplined fire. Supporting tanks fired high-explosive shells into suspected German positions. Branches snapped apart. Snow exploded into the air. Smoke drifted slowly between the trees, making it even harder to see. For nearly 2 hours, neither side gained a clear advantage. Eventually, American squads managed to work around the German flank. Their movement threatened to cut off several enemy positions. German resistance began to weaken. Some soldiers withdrew deeper into the woods, while others remained behind to delay the American advance. The battle cost lives on both sides. American medics immediately moved forward once the firing slowed. Carrying Red Cross medical bags, they crawled through the snow to reach wounded men lying between the lines. They ignored the danger because that was their duty. Every minute mattered. A badly wounded soldier could survive if treated quickly. One young infantryman had been struck in the shoulder. Another suffered severe leg wounds from mortar fragments. Several others could no longer walk. They were exhausted, cold, and grateful simply to be alive. The medics worked with remarkable calm despite the freezing conditions. Bandages were wrapped tightly. Morphine was administered where available. Casualty tags were attached to uniforms so field hospitals would know what treatment had already been given. Nearby, German resistance seemed to disappear. American officers believed the engagement was ending. They were wrong. Farther inside the forest, a surviving German command group had gathered around an experienced officer. His unit had suffered heavy losses. Communications with higher headquarters had become unreliable. Reports arriving from neighboring sectors painted an increasingly desperate picture. American armor continued advancing despite snow and fuel shortages. Every kilometer lost brought Allied forces closer to Germany itself. The officer understood that his position was collapsing. Military discipline across parts of the German front had become strained during the final months of the war. Some commanders continued following the laws governing prisoners and wounded personnel. Others, overwhelmed by defeat, fear, or anger, abandoned those standards entirely. What happened next remains one of the darkest possibilities any battlefield can produce. The German officer received information that wounded American soldiers remained exposed near the edge of the woods while medical personnel treated them. Instead of allowing evacuation, he made a decision. His surviving men hesitated. Even among battle-hardened soldiers, there were orders that felt different from ordinary combat commands. Yet discipline inside the German army remained powerful. Refusing a direct order carried enormous risks. Fear, confusion, exhaustion, and years of military conditioning could force ordinary men into extraordinary crimes. Moments later, several German soldiers quietly moved back toward the American casualty area. The Americans had no reason to expect another attack. Most rifles rested beside stretchers. Medics focused entirely on saving lives. Some wounded men were too weak even to raise their heads. Then gunfire shattered the silence once again. The burst lasted only seconds. But it changed everything. When nearby American troops rushed toward the sound, the attackers had already disappeared into the forest. At first, nobody understood what had happened. Several wounded men who had survived the morning battle were now dead. Others had been hit again while receiving treatment. Medical equipment lay scattered across the snow. Blood-stained white bandages that moments earlier represented hope. The surviving medic could barely describe the attack. His first words were simple. The battle had already been over. Officers immediately secured the area. Investigators examined shell casings, firing positions, and the direction of bullet impacts. Experienced combat leaders quickly realized something deeply disturbing. This had not been a firefight between opposing forces. The pattern showed deliberate targeting of men who were already wounded. The evidence refused to fit normal battlefield chaos. Word spread rapidly through nearby American units. Veterans who had endured months of brutal combat found themselves unusually quiet. Many had accepted death as part of war. They understood artillery mistakes, they understood accidental crossfire. But deliberately firing on wounded soldiers receiving medical care crossed a line respected by professional armies across generations. Nobody yet knew which German officer had issued the order. Nobody even knew his name. Only fragments of information existed. A handful of surviving attackers. Footprints leading deeper into the forest. Witnesses describing German uniforms disappearing among the trees. One missing piece remained hidden. Whoever gave that command was still alive. And somewhere beyond the snowy hills, reports carrying this terrible discovery were already moving toward the headquarters of General George S. Patton. The officer responsible believed the chaos of the Ardennes offensive would bury the truth forever. He could not know that every hour brought Patton's advancing Third Army closer. Nor could he imagine how quickly the hunt for answers was about to begin. By the evening of the next day, the report had reached the headquarters of General George S. Patton. Like many stories that have grown over decades, later retellings often describe Patton immediately launching a personal manhunt after hearing about the attack. The historical reality is more complex, but no less powerful. Patton had long demanded strict discipline from his own soldiers and expected the enemy to follow the accepted laws of war. Deliberately killing wounded men or firing on medical personnel was considered a serious war crime, not simply another battlefield incident. The report landed on the desk of officers already overwhelmed by the Battle of the Bulge. Entire divisions were moving day and night. Fuel shortages threatened armored columns. Bridges had to be repaired under enemy fire. Thousands of casualties required evacuation through snow-covered roads. Yet this report stood apart from the others because it described something that should never have happened. Patton ordered that every available detail be collected. Witness statements were compared. Unit locations were mapped. Intelligence officers questioned prisoners captured during nearby fighting. Military police were instructed to document the evidence carefully. The objective was no longer just defeating another German unit. The objective was identifying the officer who had issued the unlawful order. As investigators worked, American forces continued their relentless advance. The Third Army pushed through villages buried under snow, crossing icy streams and clearing one defensive position after another. German resistance was growing weaker. Many units were retreating toward the east while attempting to slow the Allied advance with mines, demolitions, and small rearguard actions. Among those withdrawing was the German formation linked to the attack. Its commander believed he had escaped notice. The battlefield where the wounded Americans had been found was now several miles behind the front line. Fresh snow had covered many footprints. Burned vehicles littered the roads. Entire companies had disappeared in the chaos. To him, the war itself seemed large enough to hide one more crime. But investigators kept finding small pieces of the puzzle. An American medic survived the attack and remembered the direction from which the gunfire came. Another infantryman recalled seeing distinctive camouflage smocks worn by several German soldiers. Captured German prisoners identified which formations had occupied that section of the forest on the day of the attack. A field map recovered from an abandoned command post narrowed the possibilities even further. Each clue by itself meant very little. Together, they began pointing toward a single unit. Meanwhile, Patton refused to let the incident disappear beneath the endless stream of operational reports. His headquarters emphasized that violations of the laws of war would be investigated whenever possible, regardless of how quickly the front moved. Officers understood that discipline depended not only on winning battles, but also on maintaining standards, even in the middle of Europe's largest winter campaign. The search did not unfold like a detective novel where one dramatic discovery solved everything overnight. Instead, it advanced through patience, paperwork, interviews, captured documents, and battlefield intelligence. That was how military investigations usually worked. Several days later, American troops overran another German command position after a brief but violent engagement. Among the captured documents were operational orders, personnel lists, and handwritten notes identifying officers responsible for local sectors during the period of the attack. Intelligence specialists immediately compared the names with previous reports. One officer's name appeared again and again. He had commanded the exact sector where the wounded Americans had been found. He had remained in position during the time of the attack. He had supervised the surviving troops who later withdrew through the same forest. Although proving individual responsibility in wartime was never easy, investigators believed they had finally identified the commander connected to the crime. The German officer was no longer just another retreating commander. He had become a wanted man. By this stage of the war, Germany's military situation was collapsing. Fuel reserves were dangerously low. Replacement soldiers often lacked proper training. Allied aircraft dominated the skies whenever weather allowed. Experienced officers who had once directed successful campaigns were now struggling simply to hold defensive lines for another day. The officer responsible soon found himself facing a different problem. Patton's armored spearheads were advancing faster than expected. American tanks bypassed isolated strongpoints, leaving infantry to eliminate them later. Engineers repaired bridges almost as quickly as German troops destroyed them. Artillery batteries displaced forward with remarkable speed. The pressure never stopped. Retreat routes became crowded with damaged vehicles, horse-drawn wagons, refugees, and exhausted soldiers. The hunter was becoming the hunted. Eventually, American forces surrounded several German positions during another offensive. Hundreds of enemy soldiers surrendered after realizing escape had become impossible. Officers and enlisted men were separated for questioning according to standard procedure. Intelligence teams compared identities against their growing collection of reports from previous engagements. The name investigators had been searching for finally appeared among the prisoners. Whether he expected to disappear among thousands of other captives or believed nobody knew about the order remains unknown. What is known is that American investigators already had witnesses, documents, and operational records connecting him to the sector where the attack had occurred. For the wounded Americans who never returned home, the war had ended in a snowy forest. For the officer accused of ordering their deaths, another kind of battle was just beginning. Following Germany's surrender in May 1945, Allied authorities investigated numerous incidents involving unlawful killings of prisoners and wounded personnel. Evidence gathered during the war formed the foundation for many later prosecutions. Some officers faced formal trials. Others escaped because evidence had been destroyed or witnesses could no longer be located. The confusion of the final months of the war made complete justice impossible. Yet one principle emerged clearly from these investigations. An officer could no longer hide behind the claim that he had simply commanded troops during a difficult battle. Leadership carried responsibility. Orders carried consequences. The idea that commanders could be held personally accountable became one of the defining legal lessons of the Second World War. For Patton, the campaign continued without pause. His Third Army crossed rivers, liberated towns, and drove relentlessly into Germany until the war in Europe finally came to an end. He never allowed anger alone to guide military operations. His response was built on discipline, pressure, and determination to ensure that those responsible for crimes against his soldiers would face investigation whenever circumstances allowed. The snow eventually melted across the Ardennes. The shell craters filled with rainwater. Trees scarred by bullets slowly grew new branches. To anyone passing through years later, the forest appeared peaceful again. But beneath that quiet landscape rested the memory of men who had survived one battle only to become victims of a decision that violated every accepted rule of civilized warfare. Their story reminds us that war is not measured only by territory captured or armies defeated. It is measured by the choices made under impossible pressure. Every commander possesses the power to protect life or to abandon humanity. One order can save dozens of soldiers, Another can stain a military career forever. The German officer believed the freezing wind, the smoke, and the chaos of the Ardennes would bury the truth beneath fresh snow. Instead, every clue survived. A medic's testimony, a set of footprints, captured documents, witness statements, patient investigators, and the determination of an army that refused to forget its wounded. In the end, the greatest revenge was not blind anger. It was accountability. Because battles eventually end. Empires eventually fall. But history has a remarkable way of finding those who believed nobody was watching.
If you want more content like this, subscribe now and comment below.